Hi guys, my name's Nicole and I'm going to be talking about the carnival mirror effect. And basically that's the idea that our criminal justice system acts as a carnival mirror would, where it magnifies and distorts the threat of street crime while minimizing the harms of white-collar crimes. And the man who coined this term is Jeffrey Riemann. He's the author of The Rich Get Richer and The Poor Get Prison. And he coined this term as part of his Pyrrhic defeat theory, which was actually taken from a lot of other theories that were out there in criminology. And then he blended some of his own ideas into that to build off of them. So the idea that crime serves important functions for society was from Emile Durkheim. Karl Marx said that public policy was serving the interests of the rich and powerful and was used as a tool of oppression. Kai Erikson believed that institutions were designed to fight crime were actually contributing to crime in a lot of instances. And Richard Quinney believed that the reality of crime is created by laws that define what a criminal is and how we actually treat those that break the law. So he is very quick to say that this is not a conspiracy theory. It's just the idea that the criminal justice system fails to protect us, as in it hasn't lowered rates of crime, and it projects a very specific image of what our threat to society is. And that image tends to be focused on the poor, and this is a natural consequence of living in a capitalist society rather than a grand conspiracy theory. He focuses on crime at a macro level, meaning he doesn't want to just look at the individual causes, but more society as a whole. So here's an example of some headlines that were brought to us in the news. 14 die in blast at BP oil refinery, and massacre at mall in Omaha, 8 killed. Both were pretty bad. A lot of people died. For the BP oil blast, 15 people died, 170 were injured, and all they did was face a few fines from OSHA and the EPA. They were never charged criminally, even though they were found to be lacking in oversight and safety protections and all of that. So the actual rate of people dying from a result of on-the-job injuries and illnesses related to work is 4 to 1 when compared to dying in the street or as a result of street crime. And we see this trickle into a lot of parts of our lives, even in the telling of history. On the photo on the left, we have a mass grave that was dug at Wounded Knee after the soldiers came in and basically massacred an entire tribe of people. On the right, years later, we have a photo taken in Nazi Germany where there's a mass grave dug for Jewish people. Now the people on the left were given medals and framed as war heroes, and the people on the right were called Nazis and tried as war criminals. Both are obvious examples of genocide. Now, we see this even today with children being kept in the border, on the border in cages, even though we were supposed to have a ban on separating kids from their parents about 2 years ago. That's happening on a large scale, and it's happening every day, and there's a lot of people profiting from it. On the right, we have this crazy family that made a cage out of a crib, and they were prosecuted criminally. Both look like really horrific crimes to me. One is happening on a much larger scale and is being ignored. So this goes back pretty far, but I'm going to talk about President Nixon and his war on drugs because there was a big shift in the country at that time. And specifically, Nixon was in a position where a lot of people were unhappy with our involvement in the Vietnam War, and they were protesting. And a lot of people were also out in the streets fighting for equal civil rights. And he saw this as a threat to his position, and he created this idea with the American public that the biggest threat we faced was, in fact, the use of drugs. And he created the DEA. And he wanted to target some pretty specific drugs. He wanted to target marijuana and heroin. Now, the hippies were known or associated with smoking a lot of weed, whereas they pushed this agenda of associating Black people with heroin. So the hippies protested the war. They were involved in a lot of civil rights activities. And on the left, we have a picture of the Black Panthers in their Feed the Children Breakfast program. They did a lot of work in the community. They fought for civil rights. They helped get disability rights passed. But Nixon did not like this, and about 20 years later, his chief of domestic policy actually said in an interview in 1994, "The Nixon campaign had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities and we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So along comes President Reagan in the 80s, and he sees like how well this has worked for Nixon. So he and his wife decide they're also going to crack down on drugs. His wife launches the Just Say No program. Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established mandatory prison sentences for certain drug offenses. Again, just specific ones. As far as I know, having a substance abuse disorder is the only mental illness that we criminalize in America. So aside from that, the Reagans really wanted to focus on crack. And crack at the time was associated with black people, whereas cocaine was associated with wealthy white people. So we saw things like this in the headlines where you have this couple on the left, John Travolta, and he's labeled as a party animal. It's a Hollywood tale, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And then we have the typical photo that would be pictured in the news under the headlines of something along the lines of like a crack baby, or, basically it was always like a single female and they were black. So that way everyone knew who the enemy was supposed to be. So all this stuff is happening in the 70s and 80s, and we can go back in history and we can see that there's this huge shift in the nation. So the red line here is the productivity of workers, which continues to increase in the United States since 1950. But you can see somewhere between the 70s and the 80s where their pay just kind of levels off. So their pay was not keeping up with how hard they were working. They were continuously working harder and harder and not getting paid for it. So that contributed to a lot of poverty. And if you can see this green line on the bar chart here, that's 90% of the US population. From 1979 to 2018, there's not been any significant change in what the pay scale is. This middle part here with the blue, that's not the middle class. That's actually the top 1%. And the red line is the top 1% of the top 1%. So that tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of America is taking home most of the money and therefore being able to contribute to public policy and lobby and help to create the rules that keeps their money safe. We can see here that for a white individual that's incarcerated, they're expected to earn a very low wage. Up here is if they've never been incarcerated. But for black people, there's a very small gap here where it really doesn't matter if they've been incarcerated or not, because on average, they're not going to break through that poverty line. Now, of course, the war on drugs did not include pharmaceutical companies, which have been a real threat to the American public and continue to be. And the other thing that we see happening in the 70s and 80s is this huge spike in crime. Now, I don't think it's because people all of a sudden got really wild. It's because we had more crimes out there defined for people to commit, and we were cracking down on drugs. So being a drug addict just instantly became a crime, and there were more reasons to arrest people, more reasons to hold them. And this wasn't just the male population, it happened in the female population as well. So we can see here that even today, a huge portion of who we have incarcerated is due to drug violations. And this isn't spread out evenly. So this is a chart that is showing incarceration rates just in Arizona by race and ethnicity in 2010. And I went ahead and compared that with the rates for our census according to what population was in Arizona that year. And we can see that the white population in prison is about 8% of the prison population, but they're rated over 70% of the general population in Arizona. Where Hispanics are representing 19% of the prison population, they're less than 30% of the population of Arizona. And for Black people, that rate is even more staggering. They're 4% of Arizona's population at that time, but they're representing 42% of the prison population. And Native Americans are seeing this at a high rate as well, where they're about 30% of the prison population and about 2% of the overall population at that time. So that's it. That's my presentation. Thanks for listening. Yeah, thanks.